Good to see all your faces here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's conversation with our esteemed guest, Rachel Aviv, titled Minding Our Stories and Storying Our Minds, on stories that heal and stories that constrain. We're delighted that you're here with us tonight, whether you're here in the room or I believe we have like over 150 people joining online. Understandably, it's cold outside and pajamas might be preferable. So I'm glad you're here, whichever form it takes. My name is David Goodman. I serve as the Dean of the Woods College of Advancing Studies and the Executive Director of the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics here at Boston College. And I get to have the pleasure of providing a little bit of a frame for tonight's time. This event is a product of a partnership between several organizations for whom we are deeply grateful. Though hosted here at BC through the Center, it's made possible by 4 sponsoring bodies, actually. The Moral Ecology Trust at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, the Kern Family Foundation, the Kern National Network of Flourishing and Health. I see Kamara's here. Happy birthday. You knew I was going to do that. And Boston College's Philip Cushman Endowed Fund. And I'd like to speak just for a minute to that last piece. Each year we host a Philip Cushman Lecture to commemorate the beautiful life and critically important work of this man. A close mentor and friend, Cushman soberly questioned what brought rise to our therapeutic culture and what our therapeutic culture continues to reinforce, reflect, and create in terms of individual and political dynamics. He reminded us quite vehemently that where we locate the origins of suffering, how we give meaning to suffering, and what metaphors we deploy when describing suffering are profoundly consequential. They open and close realities. They can allow for healing, or they can simplify us into something we are not. They can indeed cause harm. I think of one of the oldest Semitic texts that we have on record, the Book of Job, and how it provides an ancient and ever-relevant warning about the perils of giving meaning to or making sense of why another person suffers. There's almost nothing more fraught or dangerous. And yet we've developed entire industries and societal structures designed to heavily tread on this sacred soil. We diagnose rather quickly and automatically these days. Job's friends, if you know the narrative, were a beautiful gift to Job as they sat with him after his loss. That changed when they opened their mouths and provided their diagnoses. Things got pretty ugly, and God had to intervene and actually give a profound reprimand. Each of our stories are called to be dignified and to be allowed to be as complicated as they actually are, never reduced or cut to size. Philip Cushman called for a therapeutic world capable of revering the fullness of the person in front of me. And tonight, I can think of no better person to highlight than Rachel Aviv, whose work embodies this call. Furthermore, my dear colleague on campus, Dr. Justin Carter, who will be formally introducing our speaker and engaging her tonight, shares this passion and is a unique breed of psychologist who seeks to upset our very sorry simplifications. I'm excited to see this conversation unfold, and thank you all for being here. This is sacred work.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Rachel, for being here. And for the audience here as well, and for the audience at home and on Zoom and maybe in your pajamas, as David mentioned, thank you as well for joining us. For those who don't know me, very briefly, I'm a psychologist here at the Center for Psych Humanities and Ethics, and also currently the acting program director for an in-development clinical doctorate program in the psychological humanities. And it's truly an honor for me to be in conversation with Rachel Aviv tonight. So let me begin with a little introduction. Rachel Aviv is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she reports on psychiatry, medical ethics, criminal justice, and broadly, how institutions and their discourses shape our intimate lives. She has received the prestigious George Polk Award for magazine reporting, as well as a National Magazine Award for profile writing. Her 2022 book, Strangers to Ourselves, Unsettled Minds and the Stories That Make Us, was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. The book, which we're going to talk about soon, follows 5 people whose inner lives could not be fully contained by psychiatric categories, and she attends closely to their language, their letters, and diaries to ask how discourses about the mind can both help us and confine us. Aviv's work's been widely anthologized and taught in courses on journalism, bioethics, mental health, among others. As David mentioned, he and I both use her work in many of our undergrad and graduate courses. Her forthcoming book, You Won't Get Free of It, which we can all pick up in July, coming soon, gathers and reconceives 7 essays about mothers and daughters searching for one another. Across her work, she invites us to use epistemic humility, careful listening, and the resistance to false certainties. And I believe she offers us a model for our clinicians, for those of us in the psychological humanities, and for the public at large to hold multiple frameworks while also attending to a person's own words and their inner worlds. So I've been thinking a lot about these new programs in the psychological humanities, and I truly see your work as paradigmatic of what this field can aspire to and what it can be informed by. So you being here tonight as we launch these new programs in psychological humanities is to me a lot like Oliver Sacks, who we might talk about later, being present at an inaugural medical humanities event. So it's an honor to be in conversation, and I think it's also a seminal moment for our field, the field of psychological humanities. So to the questions.
Yeah. Does this work?
Yep.
Okay. First, thank you so much for that introduction.
Yeah. So one of the things that stands out in your work and is really the frame of our conversation tonight and present in the title is how often the stories that we use to make sense of our lives, especially those that are drawn from medicine and psychology, go on to shape our lives in really powerful ways. So I want to start there. In Strangers to Ourselves, your book, when did it become clear to you that this was going to be a through line, one of the main themes in the stories you were putting together?
I think it happened before the book. I had been working on a story about children in Sweden whose family had applied for refugee status in Sweden, and this strange thing kept happening where when their refugee status was denied, the children would develop this thing that was called resignation syndrome, where they would like take to their beds and stop eating and stop talking and stop moving and eventually kind of slip into coma or like catatonic states. And I read this essay by Ian Hacking about the looping effect, because actually they were so confused in Sweden about why the children were doing this that they like asked Ian Hacking to come and study and try to understand what was happening. Ian Hacking is this amazing sociologist who writes a lot about medicine. And he came and he felt like what was happening was that the children knew that there was this disease called resignation syndrome. And when their refugee applications were denied, they kind of fell into, like there was real depression there, but they knew other children who had also fallen into this state, and it was almost like the suggestion kind of was incorporated into their own being in some way. And then like the disease kind of gathered momentum, and once people started saying, oh, my child has resignation syndrome, it kind of reinforced what was happening. And so I was really interested in the way that like when you name something, it can become more sort of permanent. It's not just like, the name is not just describing the person is also sort of conforming to the name in a way.
And this plays out in different ways with all of the characters in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Is there one story that really stands out to you that where some kind of medical framework really went beyond describing what the person was experiencing and started to sort of to dictate what they were experiencing
Mm-hmm.
afterwards?
I mean, in the book, I sort of open with my own experience of being a 6-year-old and sort of not eating for various complicated reasons, and then going into a hospital where I was told I had anorexia, and that word itself kind of, I learned from the other girls who were much older than me who had also been diagnosed with anorexia, sort of what the moves were of this particular disease. Like, oh, you're supposed to exercise, I didn't realize that. Or, oh, you talk about calories, you count, you do these things. And so I kind of felt like my own early experience had some of that looping effect in it, where like I had this like initial core of distress that then got named, and then I sort of like, my distress took the form of the thing that it was, the category that it was supposed to be in.
You also write about how you feel like because you were younger than the other patients, that there was a way in which it didn't stick for you in the way that it might have for others. What sort of allowed you to kind of hold it more lightly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, but I think I was interested in the book in the way that particular diagnoses can sort of turn into almost like careers or become the defining fact of someone's life. And I think I was young enough that I was going through developmental stages so quickly that it didn't like stick. Whereas some of the girls who were like 5 years older than me, it became like their identity, and it was really hard to sort of develop a new identity outside of that diagnosis.
When you started to put these profiles together into a book, did you know at the outset that you'd be writing your own story as well as an introduction, or was that a decision you were holding?
No, I knew it from the beginning, because I felt like I had a particular question that emerged from some of this thinking I had been doing about like the relationship between the diagnosis and the person's behavior. And I almost felt like I needed to tell my story to kind of like introduce that question that would be framing the rest of the book.
Yeah. Then there's sort of a meta experience there of like writing about yourself, resisting a narrative. And as you're writing about it, did you feel compelled toward, or did you feel pulled toward any particular type of interpretation of your own experience, or pulled to present yourself through certain theories, or did you find yourself resisting that in writing about your own experience?
Well, I did find it funny. I kind of interviewed each of my family members about their own memories of that time in our lives. And they all came in with their sort of like interpretive framework. And then once I wrote the book, now they've all just like, oh yeah, that's what happened. Like they sort of abandoned their own perspective. So I could see how you sort of like defer to the best story of what actually happened, whether or not it's true.
Yeah. And one of the things that's, I think, interesting to draw out is the connections between your process as a writer and the sort of work of being a psychologist or a therapist. And so in thinking about sort of writing yourself into the story, how did you manage maybe how subjects in the future for profiles might present themselves differently to you, or maybe craft their narrative more similarly to yours after having read your book?
Oh, I haven't really thought about that. I think the issue I think about more is like, sometimes people will say, oh, you feel just like my therapist. And I actually feel really good about it. Like, I'm so glad they feel that way. But I also feel kind of like there's something slightly wrong for me to feel good about that, because obviously like the therapist's job is to help that person. And like, I think that brings up questions for me of like what, the sort of conflict, like writing about someone is not helping them. Sometimes it does, but that's not your like main goal. And so I always feel both great that they feel that way and like confused that that's not my job.
There is a similarity in the sort of the carefulness. It's like David said, sacred work, like that you're tending to somebody's story in a way. And there's a felt responsibility there, but at the end of the day, you're trying to tell a story rather than kind of facilitate healing or something like that.
Yeah, and I think it's been nice, like I wrote about this family, Bapu, this Indian woman who like ran away from her family and had sort of, there was like a question of whether she had a mental illness or whether she was having a spiritual experience. And the daughter, who I write about in that book, Bhargavi, died a few years ago. And I feel really glad that like the family story was written, sort of. I think it's been important for the younger generations that like, she told her story. So in that way, I like sort of contributing to a family's sense of like not losing their history.
Yeah. Would you mind sharing more about that story? I think it's such an important one from the book, and the sort of competing lenses on Bapu's life. And
so Bapu was this woman in Chennai in the 60s and 70s who was a mother, And she began like running away from home and going to these temples in the south of the country. And her family would sometimes like basically chain her and like bring her back and tell her like, you have to sort of conform to our expectations as a mother. And her children were quite split about whether she needed treatment or whether she was sort of this like radiant figure. And she would write these incredible songs and poetry, and so there was like a real gift that she had, but there was also real suffering, like when she would run away to these temples and her son would come to get her. I mean, she'd be like starving, and she would have sores on her body. And I think the family sort of spent their whole lives trying to figure out whether to honor what felt like her gift, or sort of how to live with both of those things, or the understanding that she couldn't take care of herself, but also that she had this sort of access to a world that they didn't want to take away from her.
And that chapter sort of moves back and forth between those. I remember reading it and thinking, oh wow, this is sort of this mystical experience. And there was something sort of remarkable about her ability to write poetry in a way that it was unique, right? It was hard to replicate. And then the sort of clinical lens came in. There was this sort of suffering and the psychosis lens. And then you also go to a sort of a haunted house story. Mm-hmm. Can you share more about that lens?
Well, the family had these kinds of theories that the house was haunted and that like the mother's illness. I don't know if you're going for something that I like can't even remember because it's been a few years, but like the illness sort of emerged from the house. The house itself for generations had been like haunting the family. But was there something else that you were?
You know, that's it. I remember feeling like, oh, now it's moved. The explanation has moved outside of the person in general to something larger, and it offered this different frame. Yeah.
You know what's kind of crazy is the Bapu's grandson has called me a few times, having had what I think he has diagnosed as like ChatGPT psychosis, mm-hmm. but it's a kind of a fascinating, like moving from a psychosis that is like not distinguishable from spirituality to like 80 years later, we're talking about like just sort of the susceptibility of our own minds to whatever like the technology or the sort of cultural organizing system is.
Yeah. And Bhargavi, Small World, she was on my dissertation committee, and
she was.
She was,
oh my
yeah,
God,
and dedicated her life and the Bapu Trust to finding ways of approaching people with psychosis on the street, mm-hmm. That could honor these different lines. Yeah. One of the things you make clear, I think, in the book, and including yourself in it, is that the interviewer can never be, fully invisible. Like you're present mm-hmm. in the stories mm-hmm. that you're writing, and you put yourself in there at times. This is kind of, you explicitly explore this in your piece in the New Yorker about Janet Malcolm.
Yeah.
So for those who haven't seen that one recently, can you share a little bit about your exploration of what the sort of relationship between an interviewer and an interviewee is, and how the sort of emotional weather that emerges between them shapes the story that gets told?
I mean, Janet Malcolm is famous for saying that, I wish I could say it off the top of my head, like every person who's not too stupid to realize it knows I'm gonna mess it up, but like that a journalist is always gonna betray you. And yeah, I just set that aside. Mm-hmm. But I think that in the piece that I'd written for the New Yorker, there is this dynamic that can often happen where like it feels romantic. And when Janet Malcolm wrote in the Freud archives, she developed a relationship with just sort of a normal relationship, but it reads on paper as if it were like true love. And then it inevitably like ends in alienation and frustration. I don't know. I feel like as I've written more, I have become more aware of moments when it's like false not to sort of include my presence because I see my presence sort of changing the dynamic, or I see like the way that people are responding to me as eliciting moments that are the most revealing of the other person. But I think like as a general rule, I never want to include myself unless I can't like communicate the idea I want to communicate without my presence.
Like clinically similar to like monitoring transference and countertransference in a therapy relationship. And in the Alice Munro piece, there's a which maybe we'll come to, there's a piece where you point out that you notice that you're reacting to the daughter Andrea the same way that many of the people many of the people in her family are. Right? I'm curious in terms of method, when you're preparing and you're to really get into somebody's life and to write a profile on them, how do you prepare yourself ahead of time? What are you reading? What are you thinking about? And then how do you sort of monitor throughout the relationship how you are kind of having different narratives come to mind about who they might be and what might explain what they're going through?
I mean, one thing I love is when I meet someone and they're sort of like, I have a story to tell. I've always known I've had a story to tell. I'm sort of waiting to tell my story. And there are people like that who the story sort of just, they've already like narrativized their life and they sort of see it as a story. And that's really nice. And then there are other people who sort of find their life boring and like are not sure why I'm interested in that. That always makes me feel a little tense. Like I'm trying to convince them that they are worth sort of, that they have things to say. Sometimes I will read like fiction that's related to the subject I'm writing about because it will help me like think of sort of granular details that I don't know. I remember I was writing about a girl in a kind of therapeutic, like what are they called? Like a troubled teen school. And I found that if I read novels about like girls in boarding schools or in strict environments, I would sort of notice things that would be happening to them, like on their, like that they could see the traces of the other girls who'd been in the bed before them. It just sort of, there were things that would make me realize questions I would never have otherwise known to ask. And I usually, like if I'm interviewing someone who has a medical history, if I can read their medical records or the psychiatric records, I find that it's much easier. Or like, I often ask if they've written any, journals or stories or diaries or whatever, because I find it much easier to like build off something they've already said. Like, you wrote in your journal that this is how you felt. Can you explain it a little bit more, rather than sort of always elaborating on something that they've already put out there, I find is a better way to sort of find what they're interested in.
And do you ever find as you're sort of preparing and getting into writing the profile that you're drawn to like a particular narrative, or that like there's sort of a hunger to tell the story in a certain way? And how do you guard against kind of like putting too heavy an interpretation on the sort of the data that you're gathering?
I think that's never my impulse. My impulse is to have no interpretation, and I have to force myself to have an interpretation. Like, yeah, I think I have an impulse to like neutrally relay the details in a story-like manner. And a comment I'll often get from my editor is to sort of make sense of it a little bit more.
Like to give the reader more of a framework for...
Yeah, like to sort of, like I always want the big ideas to be visible just through the details, but like sometimes some kind of connective language is useful.
Yeah. This connects to your recent piece on Oliver Sacks, I think. So I'm sure people are familiar, but Oliver Sacks came to define a certain humane and literary way of telling medical stories that corrected a sort of mechanistic or reductive approach to thinking about patients. And you draw that in your profile of him, you sort of draw out how there's ways in which some of his own conflicts end up kind of living in his patients in the stories that he tells. But I guess to back up a little bit, like what was it like to be given access to the Oliver Sacks archive, somebody who's such a beloved figure, and to start kind of putting together a story about how he told these stories.
Well, I sort of began it a bit on a whim. I had read there was a collected book of letters, and I thought he just wrote such incredible sort of raw, vivid descriptions of his like psychic angst, and I just loved the way that he wrote about himself as a young man. So I got in touch with the head of his archive, and I knew that he had been in psychoanalysis for 50 years. And so I sort of proposed, like, I want to know what that looks like to be in psychoanalysis for 50 years. And I asked if I could read the archive. And so that was the premise of why I was reading. And then eventually there was actually not that much about the psychoanalysis. Like, there were some letters that his analyst, Leonard Schengold, had written, but not enough to kind of like really feel like I knew that there was like a story to be told about that relationship. But then I did at some point as I was read this page where Oliver Sacks kind of berates himself for making things up and fabricating details, and sort of talks about his sense of criminality in relation to his work. And then at that point, I kind of wasn't sure if I even knew that. I was like, do we know that Oliver Sacks makes things up? Like, kind of felt like I didn't want that to be the point of the piece. But I was interested in how his fabrications emerged. He used this incredible word, what was it? Do you remember the word? Exography. He wasn't writing an exography. So like, he was basically taking his autobiography, externalizing it, and putting it on his patients. I think that was a really interesting idea, and sort of like a metaphor for what happens a lot of times in sort of the way that as a writer you kind of project your own desires and fantasies onto someone you're writing about, or at least your preoccupations. But to see him describe that so explicitly was really interesting. And I had also been interested, I knew that he was celibate for 40 years. And so I wanted to know, can you just be celibate for 40 years without it sort of like dripping into the work in sort of a profound way? And so I became interested in how he sort of managed other people's sex lives when he was writing about it, sort of what it seemed to me that in a lot of the patients he wrote about, he had them have these kind of wild awakenings. Like, there was this narrative that kept recurring where other people would be closed off and sort of separated from human contact for decades. And then like in one amazing sort of whoosh, they'd like recover their libido. And it almost felt like he was sort of acting out this sort of longed for awakening, or that felt like one interpretation at least.
Yeah, you draw this distinction between sort of like illuminating a subject and animating them. And I felt like there was something, did it feel like there was something sort of a bridge too far in how Oliver Sacks was writing about his patients, that he was, putting more of himself into their story than?
Yeah, definitely in the early years of his career. I think later on, when he had I think his mode changed, and by the late 90s, his work felt less clean. Like the awakenings were less clean. The gifts, it felt like it got a little bit. He wasn't being as tidy, with the narratives.
This sort of bridges into a number of stories that you've written about authors or researchers who are writing their own trauma into things in some way. So let's see, there's so many examples of that, but where to start? With your profile of Elizabeth Loftus, the psychologist who writes about memory. She is also very much about how her work and her research seems to be driven by her own experiences and her family's difficulties sort of recollecting together the loss of her mom. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and how you got into it and how this larger sort of theme of her own life started to emerge?
Well, Elizabeth Loftus was sort of a figure I had always been aware of because she played this like incredible role in sort of arguing against the idea that you could recover memories of trauma and had become, or of abuse, of sexual abuse specifically, and had become kind of like a very loved and embraced figure and then like a reviled figure at the same time. But I think the reason I wanted to write about her was because I had read an interview with this other woman who basically Elizabeth Loftus had decided that this woman who had claimed that her mother sexually abused her, that she had never been abused. And she went on this like intense investigative path to try to prove that she had never been abused. And for this woman, she was sort of living in this state of uncertainty where sometimes she felt Elizabeth Loftus was correct and that like she hadn't been abused and that she thus formed her whole identity around this idea of being a victim, and she wasn't. And then other times she would wake up in the morning and she would feel she had been abused, and her identity would sort of click into focus and feel coherent with what she had felt all her life. So I began the story mostly interested in that woman's experience of like, what is it like to have memories that feel so unstable and that also potentially define yourself. And she really felt like at home as a survivor, and she found a community of other survivors. So what does it mean to take that away from her? But then I became interested at the other thing that made me want to write the piece was I had read that Elizabeth Loftus kept this diary where she like would put little Post-it notes called her removable truths. So she would like put secrets in her diary, but in a Post-it note so she could take it away if someone ever read it. And sometimes I guess just like reading something like that is often a clue for me, like this is a very complicated person. And that itself is always something that makes me want to write about someone.
And you sort of became part of her and her brothers, right? Sort of trying to get together on a story and figure out what had happened in their childhood. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, something I'd always known was that Elizabeth Loftus said her mother had drowned. And as I started talking to the two brothers, they all kind of felt like the idea that her mother had drowned was information that they were grappling with. Like that other people had said it was a suicide, other people had said it was an accident, and it was sort of a very alive question. And so it was COVID and we all were on a Zoom call, and I sort of asked them about passages in the journal where it seemed that they were sort of, it felt like they were all like actively revising and sort of working through what kind of memories they could tolerate in real time, sort of in the Zoom call.
And so you're sort of in the position there that, so Loftus is sort of on the hot seat at the time because she's challenging trauma narratives for survivors of sexual abuse, including the Weinstein case, which is going on, right? And at the same time, you're there on the Zoom call with her, sort of wondering about how much to push on this narrative, or that she thought her mother had drowned, but others thought it might be a suicide. How did you manage that sort of, how much to reveal or how much to challenge her own narrative around her own memories?
I think I kept just asking them, like, do I have your consent? I don't want to like bring things up that you don't want to engage with. Like, you could tell me no at any point, but if you want to know what other people said, I'll tell you. And there was, I don't know, it was almost like they all had fun with it. Like I felt like they were just glad to be talking. Maybe they were all, I don't know, they approached it in like this very brainy way where they were like defending their own memories, and I couldn't quite tell how emotional or not it was for them.
And she sort of, it seemed, denied that there was any connection between her life's work on challenging the, how accurately we can recollect memories and this sort of foundational experience for her. Did that shift by the end of your writing with her, or did she respond to it?
She still was very defended against the idea that like this foundational life experience had anything to do with the career she'd chosen.
And this sort of gets into the sort of politics around trauma narratives, right? Because there's a way in that story that Loftus is challenging survivors' narratives in court of people who are less powerful than somebody who's more powerful, who's accused of doing wrongdoing. But another story that you write about, the Alice Sebold Lovely Bones author story, it's sort of the inverse dynamic where a trauma narrative is believed, but it actually puts a wrongfully accused Black man in prison because of that. So can you tell us a little bit more about that story as sort of a foil to this other one?
Yeah. So Alice Sebold wrote this very famous memoir about being raped called Lucky in 1999. And in the memoir, it's all about sort of her own act of like reclaiming her agency and going to court and getting a guilty conviction. The book became wildly successful. And then 20 years later, this man who'd been convicted of financial embezzlement sort of reread the book very closely and started to feel like the way she described the conviction revealed a sort of terrible insufficiency of evidence. And so he started investigating, and eventually this man was exonerated. And so then Alice Sebold was sort of grappling with the fact that she'd like constructed her writing career on this, and her own sort of recovery on this narrative that was like, I think her friend described it as like pulling a yarn and the entire thing unravels.
There's a way that her identity had been, there was a sort of like push towards certainty in writing the novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about this in relation to your other work as well, that writing about trauma, or as an author trying to write about a trauma, there's a lot of sort of perils in that. There's a sort of risk of going, of looking for too much certainty to get things sort of tidied up, which can be deceiving, but also, and maybe this is a bridge to the Alice Munro piece, there's a way in which writing about trauma too obliquely, without ever sort of looking squarely at what has happened, can also facilitate injustice in some way.
I mean, I think there's this really amazing book called Aftermath by Susan Bryson, and she describes how after she was raped, she had to like hold on to this story of her rape really closely in order to tell the police and to tell the doctors and to get the conviction. And she felt like in order to like start the healing process, she had to let go of that story a little bit. Like if you like cling so tight to this one narrative and you can only see it in that way, there's a way in which it becomes sort of constricting. And there was a way in which that Alice Sebold had sort of like told this story to the police, and then it became, there was like a lack of curiosity around any of the aspects of it.
And then in the, so maybe, could you share a little bit more about the sort of Alice Munro story and the way that the trauma in her family made its way into her fiction?
Yeah. Well, I don't know, like this was 2 years ago that Alice Munro's youngest daughter wrote this amazing essay for the Toronto Star about how her stepfather had sexually abused her as a child, and then the whole family had kept it silent. And Alice Munro had, then if you go and read Alice Munro's work, you can see that dynamic being worked out like over and over again in different interesting ways in the stories. That's the background, but was there a specific?
Yeah, so there's a way in which you explore in the piece that she sort of, in her fiction, is approaching telling the story, but also sort of there's this denial that creeps in, or there's this sort of denial of what happened within the family, and also it's sort of there in the work as well. There's sort of a looking away from the event itself.
I just remember thinking that the fiction was this incredible like exercise in disassociation. Like you can sort of approach this unspeakable thing from multiple different angles. But her work is so, it never sort of, one of the things that makes it so amazing is that like it never gets at the issue head on. It like keeps coming from the side. And so, yeah, there's something about the writing itself that feels like it's like reliving the event over and over again, but never sort of going directly at it.
Is the Alice Munro story one of the stories that sort of gave birth to the new book?
So yeah. I was like, I just want to write yes, I loved sort of writing about that mother-daughter dynamic. Yeah.
And the silence in there is a piece of it, the sort of the not talking, the not approaching something. Yeah,
and I think like the way that sort of denying knowledge like corrodes kind of family. Yeah.
Can you talk more about the new book? I'm curious to hear sort of how much you can say about what else makes it in there and how you decided to kind of put them together.
I think because I was thinking, I just loved the way that Alice Munro wrote about her own relationship with her mother, and sort of, she had this like incredible guilt that she like hadn't gone to see her mother when she was dying. And she sort of justified it as like she couldn't be a good daughter and also write, like those two things didn't feel possible. And then there was also that dynamic sort of recurring with her own daughter, where she felt like if she attended to her daughter's needs as far as the sexual abuse, like she would give up her writing life. So I think like those issues of sort of multiple generations of mothers and daughters felt really central in that story, and also just like the way they were able to articulate. I think there's this line that Alice Munro writes, like, my mother, it's like basically there's nothing else beyond like that relationship. And then I started looking back on my writing and realizing just like how many stories were oriented around a mother-daughter relationships. And one of the books I like most is this book called Parallel Lives, about husband and wife couples, and sort of she follows these couples as their own kind of like units. And I thought it would be interesting to look at a mother-daughter pair as a kind of different kind of unit in the book.
This may be a mother-son pair, but I'm thinking also...
Sorry, not that sons and fathers don't. Yeah.
There's a story that comes to mind when you were saying that of Naveen, who loses her son, and then there's this way that she's never really able to speak to what happened, or never make herself fully legible to the institutions that are deciding whether she can have her son back. Can you speak to that story a little bit, and what happened there in the silence around that mother and some of the factors at play?
I mean, this was I wrote this like 12 years ago, before I was a mother. And I've thought about that story a lot. This is a story of a mother who basically decided to go to work one day, was stressed, didn't have like a babysitter, and just left her 4-year-old son in the crib all day, and then got home and the son was gone because Child Protective Services had taken him after a neighbor called and said he was screaming. And so at the time that I wrote that piece, I remember my editor and we didn't have kids. And then like the New Yorker's top editors who did have kids were like, you have to explain why she did that. And I kept thinking like, it's fine. Like she just had to work. Like it wasn't that big of a deal. Like she sort of lost her mind I did not see that as like, I look back on that story and feel I insufficiently wrote it, because I sort of didn't understand what a big deal it was that mother was a single mother with no family and had like driven herself to the hospital to give birth. So she wasn't able to articulate why she left her son alone very well, but I also think as the interviewer, did not realize what a big deal it was to leave her son alone, and sort of didn't like press her in the way I should have, or just like, I didn't know how to talk it through because I just took things for granted as like a, I don't know, 29-year-old who thought like, yeah, sometimes you get stressed, you have to go to work, you leave your kid at the crib. So I think of that story as sort of flawed because of my like inability to really understand like the state of extremis that she had entered and sort of the reasons why.
I think it's interesting because if I'm remembering correctly, that's part of the reason why she has such trouble being reunited with her son, right? There's this way that other people seem to have the same experience of like, what happened? Why can't you explain this to me? That also came through in the story.
Right, but I still think if I had been me today, I would have tried to like, I feel like I would have had better strategies to try to keep, to like fill that gap of speech in a way. I just remember being like timid about, or just sort of, I think I must have asked her, but I know that my editor told me to like go back and ask her again, because somehow that question didn't feel as alive to me as it would now.
What do you think you would do differently?
I think I would have just asked more about, I just didn't realize how hard it was to, like what she was doing to have a child entirely alone, like without a community, without family, without really any, she didn't have friends. I didn't realize how extremely alone she was. And I think I would have asked more questions about that.
Thinking about the silences piece, like that there was a silence around like why this happened, and the sort of silences in trauma narratives, that there's this sort of like, unless there's sort of a rush to fill the sort of the unspeakable part of it, like in the Siebold case, which maybe leads to some, or what Loftus would say, like leads to some reconstructed memories or something like that, that there tends to be this sort of unspeakable piece, the thing that can't be said. And it actually it brought to mind the piece around the Swedish children's who were facing deportation. And you mentioned it might have been like Ian Hacking thought that there was a language there that they then expressed in some way. But there's also those sort of theories of the trauma that can't be spoken, that there isn't a language for, sort of manifests in these sort of somatic complaints and the sort of unexplained neurological symptoms. So did you see the sort of symptoms of those children as expressed as a communication, as saying something about what they were facing?
I think so, for sure. But I think what also felt interesting was like the way that they would sort of get into these grooves where like once you take to your bed and stop eating, it becomes increasingly hard to like break out of it. And eventually they were in like true catatonic states. So the way that like the body, what might have started as a psychological syndrome can like quickly become something that you can't like think your way out of.
So I'm recognizing that we're coming towards the end of our time here, but I'm wondering, across all this work that you've done, what has felt most necessary to preserve when you're telling somebody's story? What are some guidelines you would give to those of us in clinical fields who are thinking about how to do justice to the narratives that people are telling us, while also holding open the possibility that there's more that's been unsaid?
I mean, I think like using people's own words, sort of like not reframing it with like letting them, I think like it's interesting to hear people talk about like psychiatric symptoms, because it's the language that people use is often like, there's often like a gap between the words they're using and the words that the clinician is using. And then once the clinician uses his or her words, the original words sort of dissolve. But I remember, especially writing about psychosis, like feeling like sometimes people could articulate the experience in a way that, or just there was a sense that like, that words were not, that like the diagnostic language could supplant the words that they were already using, but not because it was a clean match, but because like it was such a struggle to sort of express it. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one more story. So it's reminding me of the other recent piece about the woman who had schizophrenia and then recovered from it, and that's about her relationship with her daughters as well. If that one is in.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah. Could you say, what I found so interesting in that piece is the way that once she had recovered, which was remarkable, that there were still parts of the history about what had happened between her and in front of her children and with her children that couldn't be talked about. Can you share a little bit more about that story and what happened with that family? Yeah.
So this was two daughters and their mother, their mother had developed what felt like some sort of like extreme delusional disorder, where she was talking about conspiracies, and the daughters tried to put her into various hospitals in New York City, and nothing was working, and she was becoming more and more kind of dangerous to herself. And eventually she developed cancer, and when she was being treated with immunotherapy for the cancer, it sort of like inadvertently cured the psychosis, and she like kind of woke up and had the personality that her children remembered 20 years earlier before she developed psychosis. And her daughters just didn't know how much their mother remembered. And so this was like a source of conversation between the daughters and I a lot, like, how can I ask her? I was like, I don't want to write about things she did during those 20 years without being able to ask her perspective on it. But they were very scared that if I asked her, like, do you remember like putting napkins on the walls to prevent people from spying? They were scared that it would almost like re-trigger her psychosis or just sort of upset her too much. And we like spent hours sort of talking about how I should approach it with her. And then we all had like conversations together. And as soon as I asked her about it, she was like, oh yeah, I like, she remembered every single detail, but somehow they had just never spoken about it. And yeah, it was this strange kind of like, they had all by like mutual agreement decided not to talk about the 20 years of their lives in which she'd been psychotic, and they had just assumed it was a cognitive deficit, and it wasn't.
In relation to that question, I'm thinking like, is when you're interviewing people and they start to tell you their story or they start to kind of relay their history, is there language that jumps out to you now after having done this for so long as sort of like, it sounds like they maybe got that from somewhere else, or that feels a little wooden to me, I want to dig under that? Are there sort of flags for you that let you know sort of, that make you question a little bit some of the narrative somebody's giving you?
I mean, some of it is about like who I'm going to write about. I think one of the reasons I really wanted to write about Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea, was I felt like when she described the consequences of sexual abuse, she did so in a way that felt really, she was sort of using language that I had never, like that made me see it in a new way. She wasn't, it's so easy, especially with like a really tender subject, to draw upon the kind of phrases that we've been given, but which don't necessarily like increase our understanding of the experience. And I felt like Andrea just naturally talked in a way that she had this gift for kind of communicating it in like very granular language that was specific to her life. And so sometimes when there will be people who've like been through incredible things, but if they're like drawing from the language that's sort of like, yeah, these like stock phrases, it doesn't, I feel like I don't know how, it's hard, it's a lot harder, and sometimes I don't know that like any question will sort of break out from those stock ways of seeing it.
So it's not so much like a matter of asking the right question. Or...
Maybe sometimes it is, and I think sometimes it is the person as well.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you really think I should have?
Wait, I wanted to know what your thesis was about so that, with Bhargavi on your thesis panel.
I can share more later.
Oh, not
but
now.
it was
Okay.
It was on psychosocial disability identity in the global.
Okay. Yeah. Well, are most of the people? No one here is like becoming a journalist. This is more people who are.
I think we have a mixed group. Yeah, I think people who are in the mental health fields, interdisciplinary students, potential future journalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there something you'd like to say to future journalists?
Yeah. No, but maybe if people ask questions, then it
Yeah.
will occur to me if people have questions.
So at this point, we can take questions from the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come to you so that the people who are joining us on Zoom can hear your question as well.
Thank you both. Thank you, Rachel. You know, when you talked about Alice Munro and then Oliver Sacks, like the idea of secrets, like we had a family counselor years ago, he was wonderful, and he said secrets have a way of leaking out and even going to the next generation, things that aren't addressed or covered up, and you may not know that you're the holder of it necessarily because, you know, your mom or your dad or whatever, and it came through in the next generation. So I just wondered if you talk about your experience with maybe things that weren't said that leaked through, and you alluded to it, what that's like.
I think the story we were talking about with Bapu's family felt like this incredible, just like they all saw the unresolved issues sort of 2 generations down. It was still affecting them. And I think with Andrea, Alice Munro's daughter, so much of, like, I think she would probably say that it wasn't the thing that sort of shaped her life and set her on a very different course than she might have otherwise been on, was not necessarily the abuse itself, but the way in which people carried on as if it didn't matter. And so she was left sort of feeling like she had to conform to the family culture and become this sort of like good daughter who is fine being like sexy and flirty and kind of, and then like years later realizing how much she had to like pretend to herself for the sake of her family. And I think that feels true about like sexual abuse in general, that often it's not even, it might not be the act itself that becomes the most like corrosive thing, but the sort of response to the attempt to communicate what's happening, and the feeling that like you increasingly are living in like an alternate, alone reality.
There's a part in that story where Andrea talks about her own daughter's reactions to, and says something like it takes, I think it might take several generations, but what's it?
The daughter, Andrea's daughter, had written an essay for school called like The Young and the Pretty Condition, and she talked about how her mom was so afraid of like menacing men that she like wouldn't let her wear a bikini, or sort of made her feel like all men were about to rape her. And Andrea was like, I'm just glad she can say those things. Like clearly I overcorrected. And that like this problem is not going to be resolved within one generation, but like the difference is she can speak it, at least she can sort of voice that complaint.
Other hands in the audience?
I'm curious about looking at the stories of other people has changed your own view to that.
Wait, I think I missed.
I know.
Words.
So let's try this again. I'm curious about how looking into the stories of others has changed your view or your interpretation of your own story.
I think the biggest way was being able to sort of apply the lens of that story in Sweden to my own childhood experience. I generally think like I've been surprised by how life gets more and more boring. Like I don't think maybe that's not quite right, but yeah, I don't know if I feel like I have a story in a way, or that if I do have a story, it's boring. It definitely, like, writing a lot about psychiatry and like antidepressants in my book made me think a lot about my own relationship with antidepressants, and then yet somehow after I published the book, I like lost all curiosity for that too, and just continued taking antidepressants, but without ever thinking about it. Yeah. So sorry, I guess my answer is I think my own life story has become is like does not hold any excitement.
So to follow up on that, I saw, I think, thinking about the sort of rejection of the psychiatric narrative that you also warned against. I think this was an interview with Aftab, Dr. Aftab. You sort of flipping to a sort of another narrative where it's all about the harms of the medication and maybe the withdrawal community, that sort of thing. Did you find yourself trying, that's I guess what I'm thinking, there's something interesting in sort of like trying not to fall into that polarity as you were writing about and sort of deconstructing the psychiatric narrative of antidepressants?
I think I felt myself like for a couple years falling into that polarity and being like, oh my God, like I can't believe I was sort of the normal social condition of being like a young person trying to find her way was pathologized. Why did I get like addicted to these antidepressants? And then sort of like taking a step back and feeling that there was something like really cheap and easy about that narrative, just as there's something that feels too easy about the narrative of like everyone has a chemical imbalance and they need to take a drug to cure it. Yeah, I think, but somehow I think that question itself has sort of become, starts to feel less alive for me in general, because I think like psychiatry has changed over the years and has become more sort of capable or like fluid and flexible, I think. And you know, like no one really stands by that chemical imbalance theory anymore. I think there is like a more sort of human approach in general.
The pendulum is swinging.
I think it's coming, yeah.
Towards the psychological humanities.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, that was really fascinating. I have a question that's about, I guess, what could be called the double sword of naming. And I'm thinking about your comments about hacking. But I found myself going back to a story I've been intrigued with for a long time. It's the story of Helen Keller, who existed in a quite formless world.
Yeah.
And it was only when the naming process began that, in a sense, the world became alive for her. Now, she became trapped also eventually by her own language. She was actually accused of plagiarism at one point and so on. So, you know, going back to the clinical situation, and let me just say I'm not here to defend psychiatry or the DSM. Are there situations in which the act of naming can serve a truly therapeutic purpose? I mean, for the most part, we've been talking about the way in which those names can become us in ways that might be kind of pernicious and take us over. What about the other side, though?
Yeah, sorry if I went too far in that. I completely think that like having a name can be incredibly liberating and like life-saving. And I think like one of the stories in the book about this woman who had bipolar disorder, like for her sort of, I mean, it was also helpful because she'd committed a crime and sort of realizing it wasn't her who had, it wasn't sort of understanding why she had reached that state of mind was a relief, and it marked like the beginning of her recovery. So I think the problem is not that it doesn't help, it's that like we don't know which it is sometimes, and we just sort of assume it's going to be the liberating like release of through identification. But I think that for sure is a real important thing that happens.
It reminds me of in the Monroe piece, there's a time when Andrea says she started reading self-help books and was like, well, I found it as a relief to finally be able to say codependence is a thing, right? Like there's something in that for her in a family that avoided that kind of language.
I'm interested in psychotherapy versus medication versus something that we can't, something more mysterious. Like, are you familiar, for example, with Eddiehism?
With what's it called?
Eddiehism? Okay, so let's say someone who lived during the Holocaust, like Eddie, for example, she's the most well-known, and similar to Anne Frank, who you probably have heard of, I imagine, right? So that there's something within us that's mysterious, that's not psychotherapy or medication, but something that helps us to get through other than psychotherapy and meditation. You want to address, do you have some thoughts about that mysterious part of us that is our own psychotherapist, for example? Or our own healer, rather, not our own. If you don't, that's fine. I just thought I'd throw it out.
I think that it's like silly in my own mind that it's like, I think that there are other ways of feeling like healed or well, to just like be talking about it as if it were this conversation between therapy and psychiatry really feels silly, but
I mean, like the spiritual component, the more mysterious component. I wonder if you've had any thoughts about that.
just that I would like to have those.
I'd like to have it. Okay. Yay. Okay, thank you so much.
Right at the beginning, when you started talking about the Sweden example and the looping, and consistently now, to thinking about like the micro story of labels and somewhat following from naming. In my work, that's a lot of vulnerable populations. Naming the category, whether it's homelessness or at-risk children or communities with disabilities, or just on and on, like a ton, where the naming and the categories are really helpful for advocacy, they're helpful for legal work, and then accessing resources, but then end up being just problematic all the time. And I'm not, my work, I'm not an expert in the DSM and all that, but just with homelessness, right? There's experiencing homelessness. That just seems to minimize and reduce what's deeply dehumanizing, right? Or homeless, someone who's homeless versus unhoused. Well, unhoused feel clinical because the catastrophic loss of a sense of home is what kind of defines your, or a single mom versus young mom. There's so much stigma around a single mom, or at-risk youth versus system-involved youth, right? And even into our own stories, right? Latina, Guatemalteca, or when you don't present that way, right? Or from my own story too, where it's, I'm a victim, I'm a survivor, I'm a warrior. And then I love internal family systems that kind of help. So in your work of storytelling, and even these labels, like these, they at times loop, at times feel permanent, at times like speak to complete and utter identity as if that is the only, or maybe two others, right? You've alluded to it, but have you experienced in the stories that you've held over time shifts in the labels, shifts in how they're held, valuing or prioritizing, expanding or narrowing? What have you seen in that?
I mean, definitely the language has changed. Like, I think I used to use the word inmate for someone in prison. Now, I think, yeah, it's sort of like on a just language basis that has changed. The thing that I thought about when you were talking was, I once wrote a story about a woman who had schizoaffective disorder, and in order to get out of the psychiatric hospital she was in, she had to like sign a piece of paper that basically said she had a mental illness, and then she would get housing. And sorry. And she like wouldn't sign the piece of paper that said she had a mental illness, even though she wanted housing. The only way to get housing was to attach that need to a mental illness. And like for her, that label sort of took away from everything she thought she was. And I remember thinking, and she ended up dying, like she ended up walking into the hospital and like going into a abandoned house and sort of living there. And I remember thinking that if only the hospital could have sort of decoupled those two things. Like if she could have just spoken in her own language and said like, I need housing, like I'm alone, I don't want to live alone, I just need a house. Like it was striking to me that like, for whatever bureaucratic reasons, those two things needed to be joined, and like she just couldn't do that.
Just going back to that story you just told at the beginning about yourself and about that kind of looping. The kids in Sweden, where a label or a diagnosis or naming then gets internalized, owned, and performed into. And I guess the question is why? Why do we do that? And I say we because I think it's kind of a common. Intuitively, it seems like, yeah, what humans do that. Why? What's the why, or the answer to why?
I guess I think like we're just a lot more suggestive than we realize, and that we're not as independent thinking, and that it's really hard to kind of like bat away a thought that is about the mind. Like if someone is telling you that your mind is doing this thing, it's just hard not to internalize it. So yeah, for me, it's like the people are just very porous and suggestible, even if we would like to think we're not.
In kind of a similar vein with the suggestibility, I really appreciated what you were talking about, how there's this kind of like true experience that then when psychiatric labels are thrown onto it, it gets kind of embodied, reinterpreted. And I'm curious, like, especially thinking about how also like psychiatry and psychological discourse is kind of the dominant discourse in terms of like making sense of these things. I'm curious in your experience as a journalist, like, do you have those moments where people are kind of embodying certain discourses or certain narratives that are a little detached from their own? And if so, how do you kind of get past that veneer to like what is a little bit more kind of the underbelly of what's going on?
Yeah. Right, I think some of that is like deciding, like comes in the sort of decision of what to write about or who to write about. And then I think it is like the specificity, which to me comes from like finding the moment in something they said or wrote that seemed the most like kind of unexpected and specific to their experience, and sort of asking them about that moment. And maybe making the person feel comfortable too, because I think like in a moment of discomfort, it's easy to sort of reach for the phrase that you've heard other people say. So creating like an environment where someone feels like they're really thinking about their own experience and not sort of what other people think their experience should be.
Hey, thanks so much. My mind keeps going back to the word of exography that you kind of invited us to. And even thinking about that piece that you read wrote about Oliver Sacks, it feels like I'm able to really get to know him and see the complexity of, what his mom was saying and transferring to him, and even his dad asking, did he finally produce that work of Freud? You can see kind of the generational ways that this idea of looping and naming is not just given by systems, but by families as well. Some of the intergenerational stuff that we were talking about is brought up by this. And our clinical group practice has been thinking about writing up some of our cases. And as a narrative therapist, I find resistance to that because I typically ask the person what they want clinically written in their own words, in their own labels, as opposed to the psychiatric labels that the DSM. However, one of the other clinicians noted that in psychoanalysis, the case itself is the fantasy of the therapist, in which I don't know the veracity of the case. And to your note, Oliver's earlier works feels kind of smooth because there's a fantasy playing out or maybe a theory playing out. So I guess I'm curious, when I read your work or others' journalists' work, I find the complexity of the person in it. Sometimes when I read case material, I can see how a theory overlays for this treatment. So I'm curious, like, what are your hopes when we engage in people's stories that you're, I'm curious what your hopes are when we engage those pieces.
Well, I think that's a really good way of putting it in the Oliver Sacks situation of like, or just a case study in general, being the sort of part the fantasy or the projection of the person writing it. I sometimes I'm writing a piece right now where I've become really self-conscious about like how much I love when people write journals. So it's like, what fantasy am I playing out with these like people who are like writing their story? Like, there's this way of romanticizing. Like, is it interesting to anyone else that this person wants to be a writer, or is it only interesting to me because I have this like immediate connection? So I think like even in capturing someone's complexity, there are ways in which you choose a person because of this kind of like almost sentimental feeling of, I don't know. I for the first time in my life, I'm like, it's like corny that I'm like writing about another person who's like kept journals their whole life. But I just think that's interesting. I think it's interesting to be able to, I think in the case study, to be able to see the fantasy sort of in writing, which is not that different from like the way we project onto any encounter. But I do think like the more beautiful the case study, the more space there is for that kind of projection. And like the Freud studies or the Oliver Sacks studies are quite beautiful.
Time for one more question.
Thank you so much for just so a range of fascinating stories. I think I have 3 related questions. The first one, I'm curious about how you would define narrativization. You mentioned that in your interview process, you would notice some people, their life stories are already narrativized. So it seems that you're looking for something that is beneath or beyond naming. I'm just curious about how you would think about the qualities of that kind of narrativization. And the second question I'm curious about, you mentioned porousness, suggestibility, So in light of that, I'm interested in knowing, in the second story, you mentioned about these competing lenses, right? So the clinic lens, the poetic or the spiritual lens, and then also this very deeply mysterious, you know, the spatial, the house is haunted. And then kind of in relation to that, just maybe the third kind of layer of the question, and kind of echoing back to all the questions that have been raised, is just about the deep mystery of language itself. We've talked about naming, and then in one of the stories you talked about how the two daughters are worried about talking about, you know, putting that memories in language would kind of trigger the symptom again. And I think another gentleman talked about secrets, the phantoms, and I know that there's, Abraham wrote about staged words. So there is the action of speaking, but there's no content of speaking. But in any case, I'm just really enriched by just kind of the raw, the fascinating life worlds that you've conveyed tonight.
Thank you. I feel like I'm not quite sure where to begin with the question. Yeah, wait, can you ask the question part one more time, just so I know where to?
Sorry, I think I'm super curious about, as a journalist and writer, how would you define narrativization?
Oh, okay. I think what I meant is, just the fact of sort of, I don't know if I'm defining narrativization, but I think like some people move through life having told their life as a story, whether that comes from like having gone to therapy or sort of written their story, and then some people sort of have never put their story into like a plotted chronology, and I do find it, there's a way in which people who have already been like telling their story to themselves, sometimes when I interview them, it feels more collaborative, like they're sort of offering their story, and then I'm like maybe asking them questions that might complicate it or enrich it. But I think that's I like that idea. As a journalist, I always like when someone like needs help to like sort of wants that story to come out and feels like they have something to say. Because there are other versions where I'm sort of convincing someone they have something to say, and that can feel more like, I don't know that I want to be in that position if they don't have anything. I prefer for someone to feel like they're looking for help telling the story.
Especially if they keep journalists.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe just one final question. I'd love to know, just to kind of close out the sort of looping effect. You write these stories, and then people read them about themselves. Is there a moment of revelation, or do people come right? People get back to you about how they feel the story has changed their own understanding of themselves, or is it mostly a place you've arrived at together by the time you get to the?
Actually, the story I wrote about the mother who was sort of cured of psychosis, I felt like we went through this interesting process with fact checkers who were sort of going through each moment of their lives, and somehow for everyone that process of like creating a shared narrative between both daughters and the mother, they described it as like a breakthrough in their own family therapy. It was like they had this like certified, like this is sort of the story we can all agree on, and now we can all talk about it and like take our conversation a couple steps further. Whereas before there was so much like tentative feeling about how does this other person remember, and the mother sort of doubting the way that the daughters remembered. But they would joke that like their mom was like, well, Rachel agreed that that's what happened, so like we could sort of move on. And that was really amazing to feel like I had sort of produced a document that was helpful for their like family conversations and therapy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the question.